Thank you so much for having me be here as part of the faculty. I really appreciate an opportunity to share how the opioid epidemic has affected our office and give you a little piece of my day-to-day life in North Carolina. I also want to thank everyone in this room, because being in this room gives me hope that perhaps my job might get a little less busy in the next couple years, because we certainly have taken the brunt of the opioid epidemic in the medical examiner's office. So I want to explain to you exactly what our role is in the state of North Carolina. I want to talk about the increases in opioid deaths that we have seen. I have the most up-to-date epidemiological data from the state. We are also going to touch upon the stimulants that in the past couple years, not only in North Carolina, but across the forensic community in the United States, we have seen an increase, and this will be the next big problem. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the unknown powders, the unknown pills that we've been seeing on the streets, and some of these natural opioid replacements or therapies that are being used by people in order to combat their problem. They're using them at home, they're finding solutions from the internet, and they are just not approved treatments right now, and hopefully ever. So we all know that this is a public health crisis, but I really want to share with you the most up-to-date information and show how we have increased over the years dramatically, and we are at that plateau stage that's been touched upon by our previous speakers, but I don't want that plateau to make us breathe a sigh of relief, because we have seen such a dramatic increase that this plateau does not mean that we are out of the woods. This article is important to me because it recognizes that there is no end in sight for the medical examiner community. These articles were written in 2017, but it really does reflect what we see today, because just last week we had 25 autopsies in our office, and I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you know how many staff pathologists we have, those autopsies end up being trickled to the rest of the week because we don't have the staff to complete the work. And so the autopsies are being done Monday through Saturday. I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon, but that leaves us in a really sorry state on certain Mondays, depending on what has happened over the weekend. And so there are statutes that describe what we do and when we do it, but I really want to touch upon what the previous speakers have said and build upon that, because we really have seen that tremendous problem when folks get let out of jail. The struggle is real. They are being let out of jail, they are going back to their former use habits, and that will land them in our office. And so it is on a weekly basis that we see these decedents who have been recently let out of jail. They go home, they party with their friends and family, and then they end up deceased. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the toxicology lab. I don't want to dwell on it, but I do want to recognize the hard work that my team provides to this state. We serve all 100 counties. So while our pathologists in our office, it's regional and centralized, and there are regional autopsy centers around the state, the toxicology lab serves all 100 counties. So any overdose that is seen in the state of North Carolina is handled by our office if it results in a death. Right now, there are 3 toxicologists capable of signing out these drug deaths, myself and my colleague, Dr. Brower. Our chief's position is vacant, and it has been vacant for 8 months. So it's been a busy 8 months. This is why I look really tired. I'm hoping to get through this presentation in one piece. But we have had a lot of work on our plates. We do have other chemists that are certified in alcohol analysis, but we serve the entire state with only about 16 and a half employees. That's a lot of toxicology for 16 and a half people. We've seen tremendous turnover because of the opioid epidemic. We're suffering from burnout. The good news is we have just recently received our ABFT certification for another 2-year cycle. The inspection was at the beginning of March, and because of the efforts of our QA/QC chemists, we did not have a hair out of place. We did not have any mandatory changes to our program. We are a solid program. And so we have been seeing some of the federal funding. We have 2 recent additions from the CDC because of this grants, And I hope that our state is going to see the need in our office and increase our staff. So the scope of my presentation will be surrounding opioid epidemics. We test for any compound that is capable of causing death in a decedent, but these last couple years we have been really just slaughtered with opioids. I took the headline from an article that in 2017 we've seen the second highest increase in opioid deaths, and below that I took a graph from our epidemiologist Allison Miller that demonstrates that. I do want to point out, do not get excited about the downward slope because the 2018 data is not yet complete. We are still signing out cases within our office for 2018, and the epidemiological data is going to have to catch up later in this year. I am happy to agree with the fact that this problem was plateauing, but as you see, it's not nearly where it was years ago. So we're still seeing a lot of opiates in the office. So when do we get involved? We are going to get involved when there are known causes of death. We are just going to do an alcohol analysis. When it is unknown, we are going to do screening analyses and confirmatory analyses to show what poisons could have caused death. And so really, we're not going to go through everything that we do, but I do want to make sure that everyone here recognizes that when new drugs and new analogs come out on the streets, it will take us longer to get our results out because we need validated methods in order to capture the quantities and the concentrations that are causing death. If outside testing is available, we will try to do that if money exists. However, even on the national level, a lot of the agencies that do the testing, we are playing catch up with what's on the street. And so while we can have a fast turnaround for known causes of death, for these fentanylogues and fentanyl compounds that I'm going to touch upon, it's going to take us significantly longer to get these results out. So full toxicology testing consists of screening and then confirmatory analysis. The types of analyses that are done clinically for medication monitoring, that is going to be more of a presumptive test. I think it's going to be a surprise to a lot of you in the room that we actually do not employ immunoassay testing in our laboratory because we have turned that away for more sophisticated technologies. And so, I'm not going to give a lesson on point of care versus forensic testing, but we have found a lot of advantages switching to more liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry technologies in order to capture some of these new fentanyls. So the cross-reactivity of a lot of the point-of-care tests that you do within your facilities for medication monitoring will not necessarily be cross-reactive for what is killing people or what people are abusing on the streets right now. So that is important to communicate with this room. We test not only urine, but blood, tissues, and then really anything that can be found in a decedent. If there's decomposition, we are going to test fluids, we're going to test brain, really anything that we can do to demonstrate what could have caused death in an individual. And so the testing is going to take a little bit longer because we need results that will be legally defensible. They're going to be clinically sound and legally defensible. So this is what differentiates testing that we do versus clinical testing or more point of care testing, because we are capturing the exact substance, the chemical fingerprint, and we are giving a quantitative assignment to that drug or poison. And so how did we get here? How did we move from the pills to the heroin, to the fentanyl, and now to more fentanylogues? The most challenging part of my day will be a opioid-dependent chronic pain patient, because the interpretation of the toxicology that will come from these decedents will be very muddied because of extreme tolerance and because of potential drug-drug interactions and the elevation due to overuse. And so clinical reference ranges and the normal reference ranges for what a certain prescription will end up reflecting a concentration in the body is not necessarily going to be true. So I always say that my job involves a lot of science and then a little bit of art, because at the end we have challenges with postmortem redistribution and certain dispositions in the body that will lead the interpretation of the results to be challenging. And so I'm going to rely on the medical history. I'm going to rely on the substance reporting system. I'm going to rely on scene evidence, behavior, and I'm going to want to look at a prescription history and try to figure out, did the prescription belong to this person, or did it belong to a family member or friend? Was the person taking that medication appropriately? Did that person have any medication remaining in their bottle at their time of death? And so opioid benzo combo deaths are very complicated for us. We've seen a lot of gabapentin within North Carolina, and really the interpretation does get muddied because these people are supposed to be on these prescriptions. In this room we have prescribers. I'm not saying that, I'm not making any judgments, right? I'm not a prescribing physician, but I can only tell you what we see on the end. And I've got a very narrow viewpoint because all of my patients are deceased. But we definitely see a lot of gabapentin. We definitely see a lot of opioids and a lot of benzos. And it's the combination deaths that are going to be most tricky for us because these folks are supposed to be on this medication. This medication helps them. And it really, there's going to be a lot of comorbidities. It is a huge conversation with the pathologist. And I will say, I know I kind of went through my responsibilities very quickly, but it is the pathologist that makes the final ruling on the cause of death. If it is drug-related, they will consult my opinion and often do, but they will be the individual signing off on the death certificate. And so, same trends that we've been seeing. We had a 1,000% increase in heroin-related deaths from 2010 to 2017. And again, I'm going to recognize the fact that the data set from 2018 is not yet complete, but we are seeing a reflection of the plateaus. Just to remind everyone, especially those of you in point of care testing, that you are relying on a nonspecific chemical response, that a lot of these opiates share the same metabolites and the same structures. And so heroin is going to be synthesized from the morphine, and several other drugs are semi-synthetic and synthesized from alkaloids. And so when you do your point of care testing, there will be nonspecific interactions within your point of care cup for similar metabolites and similar structures. And so how did we go from the poppy to the fentanyl? This is actually really fascinating because it really is based on a business. It is based on the fact that folks who are pushing these drugs into the United States and within the United States are going to rely on a much more potent drug and a much more sizably smaller drug that is easier to traffic. And so most obviously hiding a kitchen sink based lab is much easier than hiding a field full of plants. And so heroin, like peaches, it's a crop. If they have a bad year for heroin, that's going to affect the heroin. It is much easier to be trafficking these synthetic products. Fentanyl is cheaper and it's more potent. And so it really is a business to make money. There are labs in China that deal in these illicit substances, and at the same time, they are making legitimate chemicals. So it is making it very hard to pinpoint these companies. And the trafficking of these drugs occur not only in these pill forms that we're going to discuss later in the presentation, but also in eyedropper bottles, and the products are being shipped in exercise equipment. So that is how these drugs are getting to these folks through the internet, overseas, and to everyone's doorstep. And so again, another great quote is they want very small packages. They want to move something the size of a fist, and then that is really the objective of how to get that into the illicit market. And so to breeze through the fentanyl slide really briefly, because I feel like this is more introductory. The potency is going to be very well known. The dose is very well known within prescription fentanyl, but for the non-pharmaceutical grade and the fentanyl analogs, there will be a difference in potency and there will be a difference in dose. And so we have had an extreme rise in fentanyl, and the only reason I believe that the 2018, other than the data set being incomplete, is that there is a drop is because the fentanyl analog laws have controlled the incoming fentanyl analogs. And so as you can see from the graph, the fentanyl is still increasing because it's just not as much trouble, or it's too much trouble to go with the analogs now. And I, for one, as a toxicologist, am very happy to see these analogs kind of taking a little bit of a dip, because that is what is so analytically challenging for me. And so this shows over the years that fentanyl has always been a problem, but the abuse problem has been in the form of patches. And so the black represents really the patch abuse or the patch use or the patch overdoses before we started seeing the injectables and the fentanyl that was appearing as white powder. That is going to be in red. And again, we can't differentiate. Fentanyl is fentanyl. You know, we can go back and look at the case data to try to separate the patches from the injectables. But really, this demonstrates how fentanyl kind of crept into North Carolina, and then most recently how these analogs crept in. So I'm going to give you a very quick case study to show you what comes into our office on a daily basis. This is a 56-year-old white female. She was a possible OD. She had multiple meds, including oxycodone, and she had a history of abuse. And so just after our targeted screen, remember, we don't do those immunoassays at our office. This is our comprehensive targeted screen. We can already see, just from the screening analysis alone, that we are dealing with 6 monoacetylmorphine and morphine, which indicates heroin, and then we have multiple fentanyls, and we also do have that oxycodone. So that really demonstrates what was said in the previous talks, that folks have their prescriptions and then they are abusing on top of that. Now, this is really going to simplify my life, and I promise this is not a representation of what we do. I'm just going to go ahead and show you the final report, but just so you know, several confirmatory analyses were performed to get these numbers. But I do want to show you that from an interpretation standpoint, the oxycodone is actually what we would generally consider to be therapeutic. The clonazepam, again, what we generally consider to be therapeutic, and then we have these potent fentanyls on top of that. Now, depending on the pathologist and the death certificate, all of these medications might be reflected, because as my pathologists often say, you can't discount the contribution to the oxycodone because it has the same essentially structure and activity of a fentanyl. But if I had to make a guess, the oxycodone is probably okay for whatever dose this individual was supposed to be on. The problematic compounds are going to be those potent fentanyls on top. And so this really represents the fact that we've seen mixtures. Again, I'm going to go into the mixtures in the next couple of slides, but the most problematic part of these mixtures is the potency is going to be unclear and the toxicity is going to be unclear. So this is definitely a game changer as it relates to the abuse of pharmaceuticals. So this goes to show what a fentanyl really is to me. Now, again, do I expect you to know this? There's not going to be a quiz, but this really demonstrates how many fentanyls we've seen in North Carolina. And again, they're not small numbers. If you look at the cyclopropyl fentanyl, 141 cases. The furanol fentanyl, 469 cases. Now, that being said, a lot of these, a majority of these occurred as a mixture, but this goes to show how real the problem is within the state of North Carolina. I mean, these are hundreds of compounds, or hundreds of the same compounds in tests that we were not experiencing up until the last couple years. So I do want to talk a little bit about carfentanil. I stole the title of this slide from a colleague, the fentanyl. We never thought anyone would be stupid enough to traffic, because this is a potent drug. This is the elephant tranquilizer. Why is it showing up in cases? It goes back to my previous slides about trafficking. It is far easier to traffic a substance like carfentanil and get it into this area or into the regions than it is to have a suitcase full of heroin. And so the good news I have for you is that no cases have been seen so far in 2019. But as a total, we have confirmed and quantitated 52 cases in our state from 2016 to 2018. Those 52 cases include one child who somehow got carfentanil into his system as a young toddler, and the source of that drug will probably never be known. So let's switch gears and talk about stimulants that are used in combination. I just came from the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meeting for this year, and this was a hot topic. Phentermine, phenmetrazine, methamphetamine, still huge. That's been huge, but really this is kind of the next big problem that we are going to be facing as a medical examiner community. So everyone in this room, if you guys are on the front line or more on the front line than I would be, definitely be aware of the abuse potential of a lot of the stimulants and designer stimulants. So this kind of goes back to the previous slide to show how cocaine has creeped up in our casework as far as being a popular drug. So it's risen. I only have 2016 for you, but I guarantee you it is still really high up because, again, we are focusing on seeing these mixtures. So it's not that the fentanyl has gone away, but now the fentanyl is going to be seen in combination with methamphetamine and with cocaine and with other stimulants. And so I try to consult not only the scientific literature, but then also other articles and drug boards. And really the take-home message is that no one is really trying to kill their customer as a drug dealer. It's just these are drugs that are going to get people addicted. And so the mixtures and the combinations in these white powders and pressed pills, it really happens far above what is going on locally as far as dealing. So this really happens during manufacturing and during the pill pressing, not necessarily that we have dealers next door to our decedents that are pressing these pills. And so we've seen a huge increase for us in the combination of the fentanyl with cocaine. Is it cocaine-laced fentanyl or fentanyl-laced cocaine? Who knows? But the word on the internet, at least, is a lot of folks think they're getting cocaine, and then it is laced with the fentanyl. So again, this article really touches upon why it is a twin epidemic, and because this claims that the folks are seeking a synergistic high, and so using stimulants with their opioids are making them feel more normal. And we have seen a huge, 1,000% increase from 2010 to 2018 of methamphetamine as well. And so it is definitely problems of mixtures. So let's talk about these mixtures and what they mean. So I always like to start, not that Prince lived in North Carolina, but I always like to start with these articles because I think that this is kind of a misconception. When we say that Prince might have been the casualty of a counterfeit pill problem, I believe it kind of muddies the waters, and I didn't know Prince personally, but I'd like to hope that if he wanted a legitimate prescription from a doctor of hydrocodone, that he could have gotten it. So I get really nervous when I see some of these headlines, and I talk to my team about this. The problem is really in the fact that the pills are being pressed in order to make trafficking easier, not necessarily to dupe the end user. And so I might be preaching to the choir, but that's something that there's a misconception that CVS is handing out these pressed pills that are counterfeit. That's not what's going on. And so what are these new novel psychoactive substances? So I like to say formerly known as research chemicals, bath salts, plant food. We've definitely improved by calling them new novel psychoactive. I still don't like this term because it's new now. It's not going to be new in a couple years, but that's what we're calling them. This goes to show new compounds that act similar and mimic other well-established drugs. So synthetic cathinones are going to mimic stimulants, synthetic opioids are going to mimic opioids, and then now we're dealing with these synthetic cannabinoids, which are going to mimic the actions of THC. And you can see, again, this is a new problem for us. And I always like to say, if we don't know what we're looking for, we are never going to find it. And even though we have the most sophisticated technologies in our laboratory, we still have unknown peaks. And when we have unknown peaks, it's going to take us a long time to figure out the drug or poison that is making these unknown peaks real. A new addition to my life in the last couple years is that I now have an Excel sheet that sits on my desk where if at the time of sign out, myself or my colleague determines that we should have a case that looks like an overdose, fits the profile, approximately a young person found with drug on the scene, no other competing cause of death, and no toxicological cause, either none or a not identified peak. We are now keeping a separate list so we can go back in the future once we identify a new drug or poison, because we do not want to miss a cause of death in these decedents. And so the packaging, it looks like baseball cards, bubble gum. I try to tell my medical examiners, do not miss the scene evidence, because oftentimes, if it is a new drug or analog, the scene evidence will be standing in the way between our analysis and a cause of death. And so there are endless possibilities. This microgram bulletin also reflects that, because in one pressed pill, this is an illicit pressed pill, look at how many analytes were represented in that pill. I don't know what is going on. I think a lot of it is quality control or lack thereof. But I don't think anybody really knows why this hodgepodge of medication exists in one pill. But this is what is on the streets right now, and we are going to be responsible for it if it caused death in a decedent. So lastly, I want to touch upon opioid replacements. Natural highs, they are still dangerous. We have seen a lot of Imodium cases. We have seen Kratom cases. We have seen folks brewing poppy seed tea in their homes, and that has caused their death. We have seen Cambo in our casework. We have seen Ibogaine powder, and then a lot of times the case histories involved talk about people who went doctor shopping unsuccessfully, needed to find drugs at 3 a.m., and where are they going to go? So this is an article that we put out a bunch of years ago. It has received a lot of attention because we were one of the first offices to recognize Imodium abuse as a huge problem, and it is absolutely not going away. 2017, we've seen about 24 cases, 2018, about 22 cases, and folks are taking large quantities in order to get a high from loperamide. And so this is it's been called the poor man's methadone in some publications, and folks are taking hundreds and hundreds of pills in order to get a response. And I really suggest, if you are unaware of a loperamide abuse problem, that you would look into that, because there are an awful lot of creative ways to make the peripherally acting Imodium centrally active by combining it with grapefruit juice, with drugs like omeprazole, and drugs like kratom. So we've seen a lot of combinations of kratom and Imodium, and the kratom will cause that PGP inhibition if I have any pharmacologists in the room, and that will cause the loperamide to be centrally active in the brain. And so that is a very important talking point. Synthetic cannabinoids, that is my next big headache. So we have had a stance at the medical examiners historically that have started before my time that we would not do traditional THC testing, because that is not a substance that directly will cause toxicity and death. Now the game changer are synthetic cannabinoids. So the potency of the new drugs, especially this latest generation, the 5-FAMB and the 5-FADB, this is going to be a game changer. These drugs are causing death. They are super potent. We are capturing them sometimes only as a drug metabolite in folks' blood and urine, and this is going to be the next big problem. And so folks that are from North Carolina, they might have seen the news from the military labs where folks were sent to the emergency room. It was shared at the last SOF meeting from folks within the military in North Carolina that the cause of that was due to the 5-FADB. So this was the vaping of the CBD oil, if you're familiar with that. And then there was suggestions in the news articles when this first came out that perhaps the vaping wasn't the CBD oil, and it turned out it was a synthetic cannabinoid. And so lastly, I do want to say that my presentation at AFS this year is centered around these infant and toddler deaths exposed to opioids, and this problem is getting worse. We have seen several cases of oxycodone deaths with infants and toddlers. I touched upon the carfentanil death. We have babies that are just toddling around in a house, for example, that could be known for its drug activity, finding little pieces of foil and baggies, putting those foils in their mouths, swallowing, and that has been resulting in their death. And so I do know that I have a very narrow perspective on the opioid problem, and this is not the most pleasant topic, but it is important for me to communicate that with you. And so I really appreciate the previous speakers touching upon the blister packs. That is going to be very important. I appreciate all the talk that I heard yesterday about medication safety, because that really is going to be key in order to prevent me from coming back next year or the year after and talking about an increase in infant and toddler deaths. So I really appreciate you being here with me. I'm going to be here all day today and tomorrow. Please introduce yourself. If you have any questions on point of care testing that I can maybe answer really quick, I'd be happy to do so. And I appreciate your attention.